Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. I remember that summer job like it was yesterday, even though it's been a few years now. I was fresh out of college, scraping together some cash before grad school. And I landed a short-term gig as a caretaker at this small nursing home on the outskirts of town. It was one of those older facilities, cozy in a worn-out way, with creaky floors and faded wallpaper, housing maybe 24 residents. The staff was tight-knit, mostly locals who'd been there for ages, and I was the newbie, handling night shifts to help with meds, checks, and whatever else came up. My second week in, I started noticing things with Mrs. Evelyn Harper. She was in her late 80s, sharp as a tack during the day, but prone to sundowning at night. She'd been there for years, a widow with no family visits that I ever saw. One evening, as I was helping her settle in, she grabbed my arm with surprising strength and whispered, "Please don't leave me alone tonight. The man with the hat comes in when you're gone." Her eyes were wide, pleading, like she was reliving some old fear. I chalked it up to dementia. Hallucinations aren't uncommon in places like that. I'd pat her hand, reassure her that we'd keep an eye out, and move on to the next room. But she kept at it, night after night, describing this shadowy figure in a fedora-style hat who supposedly slipped in after lights out. It tugged at me a bit, but I figured it was just her mind playing tricks. Then came that one shift I'll never forget. It was a quiet Tuesday night, the kind where the air conditioning hummed too loud and the hallways felt endless. I'd done my rounds around midnight. Everything seemed fine. Doors locked, residents asleep. But when I circled back about an hour later, something was off with Mrs. Harper's room. The door was ajar, propped open just a crack, with what looked like a scuffed work boot wedged in the frame. My heart skipped. We had strict protocols about keeping doors secure at night, especially for vulnerable folks like her. I pushed it open slowly, flashlight in hand, and called out softly, "Mrs. Harper? Everything okay?" She was in bed, eyes shut, breathing steadily. Thank God. But as I stepped inside to remove the boot and close the door, I heard it. A faint rustling, like fabric brushing against the floor, coming from under the bed. I froze, my skin prickling. It wasn't the wind or a loose vent. It was deliberate, human. Panic hit me hard. I wasn't trained for intruders or whatever this might be. I backed out quietly, heart pounding, and radioed for backup. "Hey, this is Alex in Wing B. Need someone up here quick. Possible issue in room 12. Janet, another aide who'd been there forever, showed up within minutes, looking concerned but steady. She was a no-nonsense type, built like a linebacker from her days as a nurse in the ER. I explained in a whisper, and we went in together, her flipping on the overhead light while I grabbed a broom from the hall closet as a makeshift weapon. Mrs. Harper stirred but didn't wake fully. We knelt down, peering under the bed, and there he was. Curled up in the dust bunnies and spare slippers was Mike, one of the janitors. He was in his uniform, complete with that stupid old baseball cap he always wore, which I guess looked like a hat in the dark to someone like Mrs. Harper. He scrambled out, red-faced and stammering excuses, something about checking for a leak or hearing a noise. But it didn't add up. His shift had ended hours ago, and he had no business in resident rooms after hours. Janet hauled him to the office while I stayed with Mrs. Harper, calming her as she mumbled in her sleep. The night manager called the police, and by morning, the whole story unraveled. Turns out Mike had a history of petty thefts from other jobs, and he'd been sneaking into rooms to rifle through drawers for cash or valuables. Nothing violent that we knew of, but it was creepy as hell, especially with vulnerable elderly folks involved. The home fired him on the spot, and the cops took him in for questioning. Last I heard, he got probation and community service. No prior violent record. We beefed up security after that. New locks, cameras in the halls, and stricter background checks for staff. Mrs. Harper? She slept better once we explained what happened, though she never fully remembered the details. I finished out my stint there without any more drama, but I still get chills thinking about what might have gone down if I hadn't done that extra round. It taught me to listen closer to those dementia stories. They're not always just in someone's head. My name is Elena Ramirez, and I was one of the family members caught in the nightmare at Sunset Meadows Nursing Home in Tampa, Florida, back in 2018. My mother, Rosa, had been a resident there for about 2 years after her stroke left her needing round-the-clock care. She was 78, sharp as a tack mentally, but her body just couldn't keep up anymore. The place seemed decent at first. Clean facilities, friendly daytime staff, and activities to keep the residents engaged. But then things started going wrong, and it tore our family apart. Looking back now, after all these years, I can piece it together without the raw panic that gripped us at the time. It wasn't some horror movie plot. It was a tragic mix of human error, oversight, and maybe something darker, but in the end, it led to changes that might have saved lives. It all began in the spring of that year. The first death was Mrs. Eleanor Thompson, a sweet old lady in her 80s who'd been battling diabetes but was stable. One night, after her evening medications, she just slipped away. The staff called it a heart attack, natural causes for someone her age. Her family was devastated but accepted it. After all, these things happen in nursing homes. Then, a month later, Mr. Harold Jenkins, a veteran with no major health issues beyond arthritis, went the same way. Sudden decline overnight, gone by morning. Whispers started among the families during visiting hours. "He was fine yesterday," I'd hear people say, joking about the cafeteria food. By summer, there were 3 more. A woman with early-stage dementia, a man recovering from hip surgery, and then my own aunt's neighbor from down the hall, Mr. Patel. None of them were terminal. They weren't on hospice or anything like that. They just went downhill after the night shift handed out meds. My mother mentioned it to me during one of our visits. She was scared. "Elena, something's not right," she whispered. "The night nurse, Sarah, she's always so rushed, and the pills look different sometimes." I brushed it off at first, thinking it was paranoia from her condition. But then the patterns became impossible to ignore. The family started talking more openly. We formed a little group chat, sharing notes on what our loved ones had said or what we'd observed. One son, whose father had passed, was a retired cop. He pushed us to demand answers from the administration. "This isn't normal," he'd say. 5 deaths in 4 months? In a facility with only 50 residents? We requested records, but the home stonewalled us, citing privacy laws. That's when we escalated, contacted the local health department, and even hired a lawyer to file complaints. The media got wind of it too. A couple of local news stations ran stories about unexplained deaths at a Sunset Meadows, which finally forced an official audit. The investigation took weeks, but what they uncovered was chilling in its banality. Medication logs showed inconsistencies, dosages that didn't match prescriptions, pills signed off as administered, but inventory counts off by handfuls. Some entries were backdated or altered, sloppy handwriting making it hard to trace who did what. The focus zeroed in on the night shift, particularly Sarah Wilkins, a nurse in her 40s who'd been there for years. She was the one on duty for all 5 incidents. Staff rumors trickled out, anonymous tips to investigators about how Sarah had been struggling personally. Her husband had left her. She was drowning in debt from medical bills for her own kid's illness. And she'd been overheard complaining about ungrateful patients who kept her up all night with calls. Some of the aides believed it was intentional. One told me privately that Sarah had a short fuse and might have been overdosing residents with sedatives or painkillers to quiet them down so she could get through her shift easier. "It's not murder," the aide said, "but it's reckless. Like, who checks if an extra pill slips in?" There were whispers of euthanasia motives too, mercy killings for those she thought were suffering. But that seemed like speculation fueled by fear. The audit found traces of higher than prescribed opioids in the toxicology reports for 2 of the deceased. But the bodies of the others had already been cremated or buried without autopsies, so no definitive proof. The state fined the nursing home heavily, over $100,000 for record-keeping violations and inadequate oversight. They revamped their protocols, double checks on meds, cameras in the dispensary, mandatory training on ethical care. Sarah was fired immediately, her license suspended pending review. We pushed for criminal charges, manslaughter, negligence, something, but the prosecutor said there wasn't enough evidence. No smoking gun, no witnesses to deliberate acts, just a trail of paperwork errors that could be chalked up to burnout or incompetence. "It looks bad," the DA told our group in a meeting. "But intent is hard to prove without more." Sarah denied everything, of course. She lawyered up and claimed it was all a witch hunt, that the home was understaffed and she was scapegoated. Last I heard, she moved out of state, got a job in retail or something non-medical. No trial, no conviction. The families sued the nursing home civilly, and most of us settled out of court for modest sums, enough to cover funeral costs and some therapy, but nothing life-changing. My mother, thank God, was fine. We pulled her out right after the audit and moved her to a better facility across town. In the years since, I've come to terms with it. Was it foul play? Probably a mix. Negligence amplified by personal stress, maybe a few intentional shortcuts that went too far. But no serial killer lurking in the shadows, just a broken system that failed vulnerable people. Sunset Meadows is still open, under new management, and they've got a decent rating now. Our group chat fizzled out as people grieved and moved on. I visit my mom's grave every month. She passed naturally in 2022, and I think about those families. We didn't get justice in the courtroom, but the changes we forced, that feels like a quiet win. It grounded me, reminded me that real life isn't about dramatic revelations. It's about pushing for accountability, one step at a time, so no one else has to go through what we did. I remember that summer vividly. the one when I spent most of my afternoons at Willowbrook Nursing Home, visiting my grandfather. He was in his late 80s then, sharp as a tack despite the Parkinson's that had confined him to a wheelchair. The home was an old building, probably built in the 1950s, with that faded institutional charm. Linoleum floors waxed to a shine, pastel walls, and the constant hum of fluorescent lights. The main wing where Grandpa stayed was bustling. Nurses in scrubs chatting at the station, residents playing bingo in the common room. The faint scent of antiseptic mixed with cafeteria food. One particularly hot August day, I arrived a bit early for our usual visit. Grandpa was napping, so I decided to stretch my legs and find a quieter spot to wait. I must have taken a wrong turn down a hallway I hadn't noticed before. The corridor branched off from the main area, marked by a sign that read, "Wing C under renovation." It looked neglected compared to the rest. Dimmer lighting, a few flickering bulbs, and dust gathering in the corners. No caution tape or barriers, though, just an open doorway that seemed to invite curiosity. I was actually looking for a bathroom. The one near Grandpa's room had been occupied. Figuring there might be one down there, I pushed through. The air felt cooler, almost stagnant, like it hadn't been circulated in months. The first few doors were ajar, and I peeked inside out of sheer nosiness. What I saw stopped me in my tracks. The rooms were frozen in time, like snapshots from a bygone era. Old metal-framed beds stood unmade, some with faded restraints dangling from the rails. Thick leather straps that looked more punitive than medical. Wheelchairs were parked haphazardly, their vinyl seats cracked and dusty. Nightstands held personal touches. A half-empty bottle of lotion, a pair of reading glasses folded neatly. Even a knitted afghan draped over a chair as if its owner had just stepped out. In one room, a photograph caught my eye. A black and white portrait of an elderly couple smiling on what looked like a wedding anniversary. The frame slightly askew. Another had a stack of yellowed letters tied with a ribbon, and a porcelain figurine of a ballerina gathering cobwebs. It was eerie how everything had been left behind, as if the residents had evaporated mid-routine. No renovations in sight, no tools, no drop cloths, nothing. Just abandonment. I wandered a bit further, my footsteps echoing softly, until I reached the end of the hall. There was a nurse's station there too, but it was empty, with charts still pinned to a corkboard and an old rotary phone coated in grime. A calendar on the wall was flipped to a date from 5 years earlier. That's when a chill ran through me. Not from fear exactly, but from the sheer neglect. What kind of place just seals off a wing and pretends it doesn't exist? I didn't linger long. I found a bathroom, spotless but unused, and headed back to the main area. Grandpa was awake by then, and we spent the afternoon playing cards and talking about his old war stories. But the images from Wing C stuck with me, so later that day, as I was leaving, I casually mentioned it to one of the nurses at the front desk. Her name was Maria. She'd been kind to Grandpa for years, always sneaking him extra pudding. "Oh, you shouldn't have gone down there," she said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "That wing's been closed since the scandal back in 2018. There were allegations of abuse, nothing proven in court, but enough whispers to scare families away. Rough handling, improper medication, that sort of thing. A few residents' relatives filed complaints, and the media got wind of it. The home lost a bunch of patients overnight. People pulled their loved ones out in droves. Management decided it was cheaper to shut it down than fight the bad press. They left everything as is, figuring they'd renovate eventually, but budgets got tight and, well, here we are. She paused, fiddling with a pen. It's sad, really. Most of the staff from back then are gone now. We've got new protocols, better oversight. But yeah, stay out of there. It's not safe, structurally speaking, and no one's supposed to poke around. Her explanation made sense, grounding the whole thing in bureaucracy and human error rather than anything sinister. I nodded, thanked her, and left. But I couldn't quite shake the unease. That night, I did a quick online search about Willowbrook. Sure enough, there were old news articles from local papers. Allegations of elder abuse rock local nursing home, with details about investigations that fizzled out due to lack of evidence. No criminal charges, just a tarnished reputation and a wing left to gather dust. Over the next few visits, I stuck to the main areas, focusing on Grandpa. He passed away peacefully the following year, and Willowbrook eventually did renovate Wing C. Turned it into storage and therapy rooms, from what I heard. Looking back, it was a reminder of how fragile trust is in places like that, and how easily neglect can hide behind closed doors. But it wasn't a ghost story. It was just life, messy and unresolved until someone finally decides to clean it up. I remember that night like it was yesterday, even though it's been over a decade now. I was in my mid-20s back then, fresh out of nursing school and pulling night shifts at Willow Creek Nursing Home, a small facility tucked away in a quiet suburb of upstate New York. It wasn't a fancy place, maybe 40 residents total, mostly elderly folks with varying degrees of health issues. We had a skeleton crew on nights. Me, another CNA named Maria, and a nurse supervisor, Mrs. Patel, who mostly handled meds and paperwork. The building was old, built in the 70s, with those heavy fire doors that alarmed if you pushed them without a key card, and a basic security system that included a few grainy cameras in the hallways and common areas. Nothing high-tech, but it did the job most nights. The resident in question was Mr. Harold Jenkins. He was 82, a retired mechanic who'd lived there for about 3 years after his wife passed. Mild dementia, sure. He'd sometimes forget names or what day it was. But he was still pretty sharp and mobile. Walked with a cane, but he could get around just fine. He loved telling stories about fixing cars during the war, and he'd wander the halls a bit if we didn't keep an eye on him. But he wasn't a flight risk or anything. He knew the place was home. That night started like any other stormy one in late fall. It was November, and a nor'easter was rolling in. High winds, pouring rain, thunder that shook the windows. Power flickered a couple times early in the evening, but we had generators that kicked in seamlessly. Around 11 p.m., I did my rounds, checked vitals, helped a few folks to the bathroom, made sure everyone was settled. Mr. Jenkins was in his room, watching an old Western on TV. I remember him grinning at me, saying, "This one's a classic, kid. John Wayne never lets you down." I tucked him in, turned down the volume, and moved on. By midnight, the storm was raging. Lightning lit up the sky every few minutes, and the wind howled like something out of a movie. Maria and I were in the break room grabbing coffee when the power surged again. This time, it knocked out the security cameras. We had a monitor in the nurses' station, and it just went black. Mrs. Patel called maintenance, but they said it was probably a fried circuit from the lightning. Nothing they could fix until morning. No big deal, we thought. The doors were still locked and alarmed, and residents were all accounted for. Around 2 a.m., I did another round. When I got to Mr. Jenkins' room, his bed was empty. TV still on, flickering with static now. His cane was leaning against the nightstand, slippers by the bed. I figured maybe he'd gone to the bathroom down the hall, so I checked there. Nothing. Called out his name softly, not wanting to wake everyone. No response. That's when my stomach dropped. I radioed Maria and Mrs. Patel, and we started a systematic search. Every room, closet, lounge area, even the laundry room. Nothing. The alarms hadn't gone off, which meant no doors had been opened. We double-checked the front entrance, the side doors to the garden, the emergency exits, all secure. We called the police around 3 a.m. The storm was still pounding, so they couldn't send a full team right away. But 2 officers showed up about an hour later, soaked from the rain. They helped us search again, shining flashlights into every corner. By dawn, the rain had let up a bit, and we expanded outside. The fenced garden, the parking lot, even the wooded area behind the building. No sign of him. His coat and shoes were still in his room, so if he'd gone out, he'd be in pajamas and barefoot. Not ideal in that weather. The next few days were a blur. The nursing home went into lockdown mode. Extra staff called in. Residents questioned gently, though most were asleep during the storm. Police brought in search dogs, but the rain had washed away any sense. Helicopters flew overhead. Volunteers combed the nearby woods and riverbank. Mr. Jenkins' family, his daughter and grandkids, came down from Boston, distraught. She kept asking how this could happen, and honestly, we didn't have answers. The alarms were tested. They worked fine. Cameras were down, but that was verifiable from the power logs. Rumors started flying among the staff. Some whispered about neglect. Maybe someone forgot to lock a door. Others joked nervously about ghosts or the building being haunted. But that was just stress talking. The administration quietly investigated us, reviewed our logs, interviewed everyone. I was questioned for hours. Did I see anything unusual? Was Mr. Jenkins upset? No and no. They even checked our backgrounds for any red flags, but it all came up clean. The police treated it as a possible wandering case, common with dementia patients. But the locked doors stumped everyone. Weeks turned into months. The case made local news, a headline about the vanishing resident that painted the home in a bad light. We lost a few families who pulled their loved ones out. I started having nightmares, replaying that night, wondering if I'd missed something. Then, about 6 months later, a breakthrough. A hiker found skeletal remains in a dense thicket about 2 miles from the home, near an old service road. Dental records confirmed it was Mr. Jenkins. The coroner's report pieced it together. He'd died of exposure that night, likely hypothermia from the storm. But how did he get out? Turns out, there was an overlooked vulnerability. During the investigation, they reviewed the building's blueprints and found an old maintenance access panel in the basement utility room, leading to a crawl space that connected to an external vent grate behind some bushes. It wasn't alarmed because it wasn't considered a door. It was a remnant from the building's original design, meant for plumbing access. Mr. Jenkins, with his mechanic background, might have remembered it from a tour or something. He'd once mentioned fixing pipes in his youth. In his confusion, perhaps triggered by the storm's noise mimicking old war memories, he wandered down there, pried it open. It was just latched, no lock. and slipped out into the night. The grate was hidden by overgrowth, so no one noticed it during initial searches. It was a tragic accident, rooted in human error. The home should have secured that panel years ago. The facility faced fines, updated their security, and I moved on to a different job eventually. But I'll never forget Mr. Jenkins or that storm. It taught me how fragile safety can be, even in a place meant to protect the vulnerable. His daughter found some closure, burying him next to his wife. As for me, I still check every nook and cranny on night shifts, just in case. It was back in the fall of 2018, in a quiet assisted living facility on the outskirts of a mid-sized town in upstate New York. The place was called Willowbrook Manor, one of those nondescript buildings that blended into the landscape. Red brick exterior, manicured lawns, and a perpetual smell of antiseptic mixed with overcooked cafeteria meals. The residents were mostly elderly folks, some with dementia, others just needing a hand with daily tasks. It wasn't a high-security prison or anything. It was supposed to be a safe haven, but that's where the trouble started. The resident in question was Harold Jenkins, a 78-year-old widower who'd been at Willowbrook for about 2 years. Harold had Parkinson's disease, which made his hands shake and his steps unsteady. But he was sharp as a tack mentally. He liked his privacy, often locking his door to read his old mystery novels or listen to jazz records on a portable player his daughter had given him. Staff respected that. They knocked before entering for meds or meals. On the morning of October 15th, though, when the day shift nurse, Maria Gonzalez, went to check on him at 8 a.m., there was no answer. She knocked louder, called his name. Nothing. Worried, she used her master key, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked from the inside, with the deadbolt engaged. Maria alerted the facility manager, Mr. Edward Klein, a burly man in his 50s who'd been running the place for a decade. They called the police right away, but in the meantime, Klein grabbed a maintenance guy to force the door. It took some doing. The frame splintered a bit. But when they finally got in, there was Harold, slumped in his armchair by the window, eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. No signs of struggle, no blood, nothing overturned. The window was latched shut from the inside too, and the room was on the second floor with no balcony or fire escape. The initial assessment by the paramedics suggested a heart attack. Harold had a history of cardiac issues. They pronounced him dead at the scene, and the coroner was called in for a routine autopsy. That's when things got complicated. The autopsy report, delivered a week later, confirmed cardiac arrest as the cause of death. But it also noted unusual bruising around Harold's wrists, circular marks, like he'd been restrained with something soft, maybe fabric or padded cuffs. There were faint abrasions too, suggesting he'd struggled against whatever held him. But Willowbrook had no record of any restraints being ordered for Harold. He wasn't a wanderer or a fall risk. His care plan was straightforward. The staff were adamant. No one had entered or exited his room after lights out at 10 p.m. the previous night. The night nurse, a young woman named Lisa Tran, had done her final rounds at 11 p.m. and sworn she'd seen Harold through the small window in the door, sitting peacefully with a book. The facility's security cameras in the hallways showed no activity near his door all night. No visitors, no staff lingering suspiciously. The local police got involved, led by Detective Sarah Mills, a no-nonsense investigator in her 40s who'd handled her share of elder abuse cases. She interviewed everyone, the nurses, the aides, even the kitchen staff. Klein provided the lock's maintenance records. It was a standard deadbolt, recently inspected and in perfect working order. No tampering evident. The door hadn't been forced before they broke it in that morning. Mills checked Harold's background too. Divorced daughter living out of state, no known enemies, modest savings that went to charity in his will. No motive for foul play jumped out. Rumors started swirling among the staff and residents. Some whispered about ghosts or a curse. Willowbrook had been built on old farmland with a murky history, but Mills dismissed that as nonsense. She dug deeper into the facility's operations. Willowbrook had a few citations in the past for understaffing, but nothing criminal. She requested Harold's medical records and found something odd. In the weeks leading up to his death, he'd complained to his doctor about feeling watched and had requested a room change. But it was denied due to occupancy. His daughter, Emily, flew in for the funeral and mentioned Harold had called her a few days before, sounding agitated about someone messing with his things. But he hadn't elaborated. The investigation dragged on for months. Mills tested the lock mechanism herself, confirming it could only be engaged from inside. She even had a forensics team dust for prints, nothing out of the ordinary, just Harold's and the staff's from routine checks. Toxicology came back clean. No drugs beyond his prescribed meds. The bruising remained the sticking point. Experts suggested it could be from medical equipment or even self-inflicted during a seizure, but that didn't quite fit. The case was leaning toward negligence. Maybe an aide had used unauthorized restraints to manage Harold during a bad night and covered it up. But with no witnesses or evidence, it stalled. Then, about 6 months later, a breakthrough came from an unlikely source. One of the night aides, a part-timer named Carlos Ruiz, came forward during a routine staff turnover. He'd been let go for unrelated reasons, tardiness, and in a fit of resentment, he contacted Mills. Carlos confessed that on the night in question, he'd heard Harold moaning in pain around midnight. Fearing a fall or episode, Carlos had used a spare key, which staff weren't supposed to have but sometimes did for emergencies, to enter quietly. Harold was having a panic attack, thrashing in his sleep. So Carlos had gently held his wrists with a soft towel to calm him, per some outdated training he'd received elsewhere. But Harold's heart gave out during the episode. Panicked, Carlos locked the door from the inside using a thin wire tool he'd fashioned for such situations, a trick he'd learned from a previous job in maintenance. Slipped out and said nothing, fearing he'd lose his job or face charges for improper procedure. Mills verified the story. The wire tool was found in Carlos's locker during a search, and it matched scratches on the lock's interior. Hospital records from Harold's past showed similar panic episodes linked to his Parkinson's meds. Carlos was charged with misdemeanor negligence and falsifying records. He'd altered the log to hide his entry, but it wasn't murder. The bruising was from the towel, not abuse. Willowbrook faced fines for poor oversight and key control, and they implemented stricter protocols. Emily sued the facility for wrongful death, settling out of court for a modest sum that she donated to Parkinson's research. In the end, it wasn't some elaborate conspiracy or supernatural force, just a scared employee making a bad call in the heat of the moment, compounded by a flawed system. The case closed quietly, a reminder of how fragile life in those places can be, and how small oversights can lead to tragedy. Willowbrook is still operating today, though with better locks and more cameras. Harold's room? They turned it into a storage closet. No one wanted to stay there after that. My name is Emily Harper, and I'm the granddaughter of Evelyn Harper, who we all called Nana. She was 82 when this happened, living in Willow Creek Nursing Home in upstate New York. Nana had been there for about 2 years after a bad fall left her with mobility issues and early-stage dementia. We visited her every weekend, my parents, my brother, and me. She was sharp in her own way, always remembering our names and cracking jokes about the fancy prison she was in. But the facility, it was one of those places that looked okay on the surface. Clean lobbies, smiling staff in scrubs. But you could tell corners were being cut. Overworked nurses, underpaid aides, that kind of thing. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, around 3 p.m., when the call came. I was at work, but Mom phoned me right after. Her voice was shaking. "Emily, it's Nana. The nursing home just called. They said she passed away this morning. Heart failure. We need to get there now." I felt like the floor dropped out from under me. Nana had seemed fine during our last visit, just a bit tired, complaining about the bland food. I left work in a daze, tears blurring my vision as I drove to my parents' house. Dad was already packing a bag with her favorite photos and that old quilt she loved. My brother Jake met us there, his eyes red from crying on the way over. We piled into the car and sped to Willow Creek, about 45 minutes away. The whole drive was a blur of grief. Mom sobbing quietly, Dad gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles were white. Jake and I sharing memories to fill the silence. "Remember how she taught us to make apple pie from scratch?" I said, my voice cracking. We were preparing ourselves for the worst, seeing her body, making arrangements, notifying relatives. By the time we pulled into the parking lot, we were all emotionally wrecked, hugging each other before stepping inside. The receptionist looked confused when we asked for the director. "The Harper family? For Evelyn?" she said, glancing at her computer. She made a quick call, and soon a nurse named Carla escorted us to a small conference room. That's when things got weird. The director, Mr. Reynolds, came in looking flustered, papers in hand. "There's been a misunderstanding," he started. "Misunderstanding?" We stared at him. "Your mother, or grandmother, is fine. She's in her room right now, watching TV." We thought he was joking at first, some cruel mix-up in communication. But no. It turned out they'd called the wrong family. Another resident, an 85-year-old woman named Eleanor Hartman, had died that morning from heart complications. Somehow the staff had confused the two. Similar names starting with E, rooms on the same floor, both with heart conditions. They admitted it was a clerical error in the notification process. Nana was alive, sipping tea in her room, oblivious to the chaos. We rushed to see her, and there she was, surprised but delighted by the unexpected visit. "What's all the fuss about?" she asked, hugging us one by one. Relief washed over us, but it was mixed with anger. How do you grieve someone for hours, only to find out it was all a mistake? We demanded answers right then. How could this happen? Mr. Reynolds mumbled about high staff turnover and a busy morning shift. He apologized profusely, offered us coffee, and promised an internal review. But it felt hollow. We left that day exhausted, the emotional whiplash leaving us drained. Over the next few weeks, we tried to move on, but little things nagged at us. Nana started complaining more about her meds. Sometimes she'd get the wrong dosage or pills that weren't hers. Once she mentioned a roommate getting someone else's breakfast tray. We brushed it off as her dementia at first, but doubt crept in. Months passed, and then we got a letter from the state health department. Willow Creek was under investigation after multiple complaints from other families. We decided to file our own report, detailing the notification mix-up. That's when the bigger picture emerged. State inspectors, during their surprise audit, uncovered a pattern of sloppy record-keeping. Patient wristbands were often mislabeled or missing entirely. Medical charts were piled haphazardly in unlocked cabinets, leading to mix-ups in treatments. One report noted that medications had been administered to the wrong residents on at least 3 documented occasions in the past year. Nothing fatal, but close calls with allergies and overdoses. There were even whispers of unreported incidents. A fall that wasn't documented, a dehydration case swept under the rug. As more families came forward, we connected through a local support group. One woman shared how her father had been given the wrong insulin dose, nearly sending him into a coma. Another family suspected their aunt's sudden decline wasn't just natural causes, but tied to neglected care. We started to wonder if Eleanor's death, the one mistaken for Nana's, had roots in the same negligence. Her family sued, claiming her heart meds had been mismanaged for weeks. Our mistake wasn't isolated. It was a symptom of a facility cutting costs on training and staffing, prioritizing profits over people. In the end, we didn't sue. Nana was okay, and we didn't want to drag her through court, but we pushed for changes. The state fined Willow Creek $50,000 and mandated reforms. Better electronic record systems, mandatory staff training on patient identification, and regular audits. Mr. Reynolds was replaced, and the new director seemed more competent. We moved Nana to a better facility closer to home, where she thrived for another 3 years before passing peacefully in her sleep last winter, surrounded by us. No mix-ups, no drama. Looking back, that day taught us how fragile trust is in these places. It wasn't some horror story that lingered unsolved. It was a wake-up call that led to real accountability. Families like ours spoke up, and things improved, not perfectly, but enough to prevent more heartbreak. If anything, it made us cherish the time we had left with Nana even more. It was back in the summer of 2018 when I was working the overnight shift at Willowbrook Nursing Home, a quiet facility tucked away in a suburban neighborhood outside of Chicago. I'd been there for about 6 months, handling the front desk from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. It wasn't the most glamorous job. Mostly answering calls, signing in late-night visitors, and keeping an eye on the security monitors. But it paid the bills while I finished my community college classes during the day. The residents were mostly elderly folks with varying degrees of health issues, and the staff was a tight-knit group, always ready to jump in when someone needed help. That particular night started like any other. The building was hushed, with only the faint hum of the air conditioning and the occasional beep from a medical monitor echoing down the halls. I just finished my second cup of coffee around 2 a.m. when the phone at the desk rang. It was an internal call, the kind that lights up with a room number on the display. I glanced at it. Room 214. I picked up the receiver and said, "Front desk, how can I assist?" The voice on the other end was frail and shaky, unmistakably an older woman's. Hello? This is Mrs. Evelyn Harper in 214. I've fallen out of bed and I can't get up. My hip hurts terribly. Please send someone right away. Her words were laced with pain and urgency, the kind that makes your heart skip a beat. I knew Mrs. Harper. She was one of our long-term residents in her late 80s, with a history of arthritis and a few falls in the past. She was sweet, always chatting about her grandchildren when I'd wheel her down to the common area. Without hesitation, I paged Nurse Carla over the intercom. She was the on-duty RN that night, a no-nonsense woman in her 40s who'd been at Willowbrook for years. "Code fall in room 214, I announced, keeping my voice calm but firm. Carla responded almost immediately on her walkie-talkie. On my way. I could hear her footsteps hurrying down the corridor from the nurse's station. While I waited, I double-checked the resident log on my computer to make sure there weren't any recent notes about Mrs. Harper. That's when a chill ran down my spine. According to the records, Mrs. Harper had passed away peacefully in her sleep 3 days earlier, on a Tuesday morning. Her family had come to collect her belongings that same afternoon, and the room had been cleaned and prepped for a new admission. I remembered it clearly, because I'd helped sign out her son when he left with a box of her photos and knickknacks. The bed had been stripped, the personal items removed, and crucially, the room's phone had been unplugged and stored in the maintenance closet to prevent any crossed wires until the next resident moved in. My mind raced. Had I misheard the room number? I checked the call display again. It definitely said 214. Maybe it was a glitch in the old phone system. The building was from the 1970s, and we'd had wiring issues before. Or worse, could someone be playing a prank? We had a few younger aides who liked to joke around, but this seemed too cruel, especially invoking a recently deceased resident. A couple of minutes later, Carla radioed back, "Hey, front desk. Room 214 is empty. Lights off, bed stripped, no one here. You sure about the call?" I told her what I'd heard and suggested she check the adjacent rooms, just in case. She did a quick sweep of the floor, but found nothing amiss. The other residents were all asleep, no signs of disturbance. I decided not to let it slide. After my shift ended at 7 a.m., I mentioned it to the day manager, Mr. Reynolds, during handover. He was a practical guy, former military, and he took it seriously enough to pull the phone logs and have maintenance inspect the system. By the next evening, when I came back in, he had an update for me. Turns out, it was a combination of human error and technical quirk. The phone in room 214 hadn't been fully disconnected from the internal line. Maintenance had unplugged it from the wall, but forgot to deactivate it at the switchboard panel in the basement. More importantly, the call hadn't actually come from 214 at all. There was a mix-up in the display labeling due to a recent rewiring job on that floor. The actual call originated from room 241, which was occupied by Mrs. Eleanor Hartman, another resident in her 80s with similar mobility issues. She'd indeed fallen while trying to reach her walker in the middle of the night. The room numbers were transposed in the outdated system database. 241 showing as 214 on my desk display. And the name? Mrs. Hartman had a slight speech impediment from a past stroke, which made Hartman sound a lot like Harper over the staticky line, especially to my tired ears at 2 a.m. Mrs. Hartman was fine, by the way. A bruised hip, but no breaks. She got checked out by the doctor that morning and was back to her routine bingo games by the end of the week. The maintenance team fixed the labeling issue. and we all got a refresher on double-checking resident IDs during calls. It was spooky in the moment, sure. But in the end, it was just one of those late-night mishaps that happen in a place like that. Made for a good story around the break room, though. Reminded us all to stay sharp, even on the quiet shifts. It was the summer of 2018, and I was working the night shift at Willowbrook Nursing Home, a quiet facility tucked away on the outskirts of a small town in upstate New York. I'd been there for about 6 months, fresh out of my CNA certification, handling the usual routines, checking on residents, administering meds, and making sure everything was secure before the graveyard hours really set in. The place had its charms. An old Victorian building converted into a care home, with high ceilings and creaky floors that echoed like whispers in the dead of night. But it also had that faint, underlying melancholy you get in places where people come to spend their final years. That particular night was one of those sticky August evenings where the heat lingers long after sunset, making the air thick and humid. The sun had dipped below the horizon around 8:30, leaving the sky a deep indigo streaked with the last hints of orange. I was on lockup duty, which meant going room to room, ensuring doors were shut, windows latched, and the exterior entrances bolted. The courtyard garden was my last stop. A small enclosed space in the center of the building, accessible only through a set of French doors from the common lounge. It was a peaceful spot during the day, with neat flower beds of roses and lavender, a few benches, and a central fountain that trickled softly. But at night, under the dim glow of the security lights, it took on a more isolated feel, shadowed by the tall brick walls that surrounded it on all sides. I remember finishing up in the lounge around 11:45 p.m., flipping off the overhead lights and glancing out through the glass panes of the French doors as I reached for the lock. That's when I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the shadows, or maybe one of the residents who'd wandered out somehow, though that seemed impossible, as we'd done bed checks an hour earlier. But there he was, standing motionless near the fountain. A tall man, easily over 6 feet, dressed in what looked like faded hospital scrubs, the kind we used to issue back in the 80s or 90s, baggy and pale blue, with that worn, almost translucent quality from too many washes. His back was to me, his posture rigid, like he was staring at the ground or lost in thought. No shoes, just bare feet in the dirt. The security light cast a harsh beam over him, highlighting the outline of his thin frame and the way his hair, short and unkempt, stuck up in places. My heart skipped a beat. We didn't have any male residents that tall on the roster, and visitors weren't allowed after 8 p.m. I froze for a second, squinting through the glass, trying to make out more details. Was he staff? No. The scrubs were wrong. Our uniforms were modern scrubs in Navy. And how had he gotten in? The courtyard gates were locked from the inside. A chill ran down my spine, despite the warm air, and I felt that primal urge to back away. But logic kicked in. I couldn't just ignore it. What if it was someone in distress? I turned and hurried down the hall to the nurse's station, where my coworker, Maria, was finishing up some charting. She was a sturdy woman in her 40s, with a no-nonsense attitude that had gotten her through 2 decades in healthcare. "Hey, Maria," I whispered urgently, not wanting to alarm any residents who might still be awake. "There's someone out in the courtyard. Tall guy in old scrubs. I don't recognize him." She looked up, eyebrows furrowed. What? Did you check the doors? Not yet. Come with me. She sighed but nodded, grabbing a flashlight from the drawer. Probably a shadow or something. Let's go. We made our way back to the lounge, our footsteps muffled on the carpet. I pointed through the glass. Right there, by the fountain. Maria peered out, then shook her head. I don't see anyone. You sure? My stomach twisted. He was still there, or at least I thought he was. But as we unlocked the French doors and stepped outside, the humid night air hitting us like a wave, the courtyard was empty. No man, no movement, just the gentle drip of the fountain and the rustle of leaves in a faint breeze. We scanned the area with the flashlight, checking behind the benches and along the flower beds. Nothing. The dirt paths were soft from a recent rain, perfect for footprints. But the only ones we found were our own. Fresh imprints from our sneakers leading from the door to where we stood. See? Must have been your imagination, Maria said, though her voice had a slight edge to it. These late shifts play tricks on you. I nodded, trying to laugh it off, but I couldn't shake the unease. We locked up and finished the rounds, but sleep didn't come easy when I got home that morning. The next evening, during our shift handover, I mentioned it casually to the day crew. That's when Evelyn, one of the older nurses who'd been at Willowbrook since the 70s, perked up. She was in her 60s, with a kind face lined from years of caring for the elderly, and she always had stories about the home's history. Tall man in old scrubs, she repeated, setting down her coffee mug. Barefoot by the fountain? Yeah, I said, surprised. Why? You know something? She hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening too closely. Back in '92, we had a resident named Harold Jenkins. Tall drink of water, over 6'3". He was here for end-stage cancer, poor soul. One night, he slipped out to the courtyard. Back then, the locks weren't as secure, and, well, he took his own life. Hung himself from that old oak tree that used to be there before they cut it down. They found him in the morning, still in his hospital-issued scrubs. We don't talk about it much. Doesn't help the atmosphere. My blood ran cold. The description matched perfectly. Maria, who'd overheard, crossed herself subtly. But Evelyn waved it off with a practical shrug. Ghosts? Nah. People see what they want to see, especially on tired nights. Probably just a reflection or a homeless guy who hopped the wall and bolted when he heard you coming. Happens more than you'd think in these old places. I dug into it a bit after that, checking old records and even talking to the maintenance guy. Turns out the courtyard walls aren't impenetrable. There's a spot where vines climb high enough for someone agile to scale over from the alley behind the building. And sure enough, the next week, security caught a transient who'd been sneaking in for shelter on warm nights. No tall man in scrubs, but it planted the seed of doubt. Maybe I'd glimpsed someone like that. And my mind filled in the rest with fatigue and shadows. Years later, I still think about that night sometimes, especially on humid summer evenings. But I've come to see it for what it likely was. A fleeting moment of human error, amplified by an old story and a weary brain. Willowbrook's ghosts, if they exist, are just echoes of lives lived and lost, not specters lurking in the garden. Life's scary enough without them. It was back in the late 90s when I was working the night shift as a nurse at Willow Creek Nursing Home, a quiet little place on the outskirts of town. I'd been there for about 5 years by then. And let me tell you, night shifts in a nursing home are a world unto themselves. The hallways dim down after 8 p.m. The residents are mostly tucked in, and it's just you, a couple of aides, and the occasional beep from a monitor or the soft hum of the fluorescent lights. But those nights could get eerie sometimes, not because of ghosts or anything supernatural, mind you, but because of how the mind plays tricks in the quiet, especially when you're dealing with folks whose memories aren't always reliable. That particular evening started like any other. It was around midnight, and I'd just finished my rounds on the East Wing, checking vitals and making sure everyone had their meds. The home wasn't huge, maybe 50 residents total, mostly elderly folks with dementia, mobility issues, or just needing round-the-clock care. I was at the nurse's station, sipping on some lukewarm coffee and jotting down notes, when I heard it, a faint call for help echoing down the hall. It wasn't loud, more like a muffled plea, but in the stillness of the night, it carried. "Help, please," it went, sounding weak and raspy. I set my cup down and headed toward the sound, my rubber-soled shoes squeaking softly on the linoleum floor. It seemed to be coming from room 112, which belonged to Mr. Harlan Thompson, an 82-year-old widower with advanced Parkinson's. He'd been a regular there for months. Sweet guy, but mostly bedridden and prone to calling out when he needed something. I figured he was having one of his rough nights. Maybe a tremor acting up or just needing repositioning. The door was slightly ajar, which wasn't unusual. Sometimes the aides left them that way for ventilation. I pushed it open gently, not wanting to startle him, and stepped inside. The room was pitch dark, save for the faint glow from the hallway light spilling in behind me. We kept the overheads off at night to help residents sleep, so I relied on the nightlight plugged into the wall near the bed. In that dim blue hue, I could make out the outline of a figure lying under the covers, hunched a bit, like someone curled up in discomfort. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and the lavender air freshener we use to mask the usual nursing home odors. The figure shifted slightly and let out a low groan, then whispered hoarsely, "Water, please." It sounded just like Mr. Thompson. His voice had that gravelly quality from years of smoking back in his day. I nodded, even though he probably couldn't see me, and said softly, "Sure thing, Mr. Thompson. I'll be right back." I stepped over to the small sink in the corner of the room, where we kept a pitcher and plastic cups for just such requests. Poured a half glass of water, cool but not too cold, to avoid shocking his system, and turned back toward the bed. But when I approached, the bed was empty, completely empty. The covers were smoothed out, not even a wrinkle where the body had been moments before. No one under the bed, no one in the attached bathroom. The door was closed, and I checked it anyway. My heart skipped a beat, I'll admit. For a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined the whole thing, or perhaps I'd gone into the wrong room in my fatigue. But no. The nameplate outside clearly said, "Harlan Thompson, room 112. I flipped on the light switch, bathing the room in harsh fluorescent glow, and scanned every corner. Empty chair by the window, empty walker leaning against the wall. Nothing. Confused, I headed back to the nurse's station to check the logs. That's when I remembered. Mr. Thompson had been transferred to the hospital that afternoon. He'd had a bad fall during the day shift, fractured his hip, and the ambulance had taken him out around 3 p.m. I'd even noted it in the handover report when I came on duty. But in the haze of a busy start to the shift, it had slipped my mind. So who or what had I seen in that bed? I radioed the two aides on duty that night, Maria and Tom, asking if anyone had been in or out of 112 recently. Maria was in the West Wing helping with a bed change, and Tom was in the kitchen grabbing a snack. Neither had been near the East Wing in the last hour, and our security was basic but effective. No visitors after hours, and the doors were locked. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to shadows and an overactive imagination from too many late nights. Maybe the call for help had come from a neighboring room, and the echo had tricked me. I busied myself with paperwork, but about an hour later, around 1 a.m., I heard footsteps shuffling down the hall. Not the quick patter of staff, but the slow, unsteady gait of a resident. I looked up and saw Mrs. Evelyn Carter from room 105, wandering aimlessly in her nightgown. She was 78 with moderate dementia, and it wasn't uncommon for her to sundown, get restless and confused as the night wore on. She was muttering to herself, something I couldn't quite make out at first. I approached her gently, the way we're trained. "Mrs. Carter, it's late. Let's get you back to bed." As I guided her by the elbow, I caught her words more clearly. "He shouldn't be here anymore. Gone to the hospital. Empty room." It sent a chill down my spine, but I kept my voice steady. "Who shouldn't be here, Evelyn?" She just repeated it a couple more times, her eyes distant, before letting me lead her back. The next morning, during the shift change, I pieced it together with the day staff. Turns out, Mrs. Carter had been close friends with Mr. Thompson. They played cards together in the common room most afternoons. She'd been agitated all day about his fall and transfer, kept asking where he was. The day nurse mentioned Evelyn had a habit of wandering into empty rooms when she got confused, looking for familiar faces. That night, she must have slipped into room 112 while I was at the station, curled up in the bed disoriented and thirsty from her medications, and called out for help. By the time I poured the water, she'd wandered out again, probably hearing my footsteps and getting scared or just forgetting why she was there. The aides hadn't noticed because she was quick for her age when she wanted to be. And the hall cameras were grainy back then. It all made sense in the light of day. No mystery, just the everyday chaos of caring for people whose minds sometimes wandered further than their bodies. I made sure to add extra checks for wanderers to the night protocol after that, and Evelyn got a bit more supervision. But I'll never forget how real that silhouette looked in the dark. Proof that sometimes the scariest things are the ones we explain away with logic.